The summer sun hung high and merciless over our quiet Arizona suburb, casting shimmering heat waves that danced off driveways and rooftops like ghosts of fire. Everything slowed in the July heat, except the drama. The air around the community pool crackled with more than static electricity that day. It was the kind of day that starts off slow and easy like a lazy river, and ends in a raging flood of emotion. I remember the sound of the lock clicking shut on the pool gate. It echoed a little louder than I expected, final and sharp, like slamming a door in someone's face. I had just finished my rounds, posting the closure notices, checking the chlorine levels, making sure no one had left towels or soda cans behind. The place was quiet. Most people respected the notice we'd sent out earlier in the week about the pool closure for emergency maintenance. But of course one person didn't. Or rather, two, if you count the voice behind the screeching that shattered the heat-haze silence. You can't do that. It was Chad. 24, tan and terminally unemployed, he was already soaked and angry, stomping toward the locked gate like I'd committed some personal offense. Chad is the adult son of Janet, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, known to the rest of us as Karen for reasons I wouldn't need to explain if you'd ever met her. Chad's only job, it seems, is to lounge at the pool blasting music, ogle sunbathers, and use the facilities like they're his private resort. Today, however, he found himself on the wrong side of a padlock. "You don't have the authority," he snapped, his voice laced with the kind of smugness that only comes from a lifetime of consequence-free behavior. "My mom's on the HOA board. You're not even allowed to touch that lock." I kept calm, explaining that the board had voted to temporarily close the pool due to a broken filter pump that posed a liability risk. "It'll be open again next week," I offered, trying to stay diplomatic. But he wasn't interested in logic. He pulled out his phone, aggressively tapping at the screen. "I'm calling the cops," he declared, loud enough for the few sunbathers packing up to turn and look. "You're trespassing on HOA property. This is harassment or something." The next thing I knew, he was speaking to a 911 dispatcher, twisting the situation into a bizarre narrative about being locked in against his will, even though he was clearly outside the fence. It was surreal. I stood there beside the padlocked gate, clipboard in hand, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a calm expression. Meanwhile, Chad was pacing in flip-flops, working himself into a frenzy, gesturing wildly like I had chained the doors of his mansion. The irony was I was the one doing exactly what the board, his mother's board, had instructed. But Chad didn't care about rules unless they worked in his favor. That's the problem with people who grow up never being told no. They treat boundaries as personal attacks. About 20 minutes later, the red and blue lights reflected off the tile deck as a patrol car rolled into the lot. Two officers stepped out, their expressions already weary, probably expecting a domestic dispute or vandalism. I greeted them, calm and courteous, and handed over a printed copy of the closure notice, along with the email from the HOA board approving it. Meanwhile, Chad was on the other side of the gate, ranting about civil liberties and something about pool privileges as a homeowner's right. The officers asked a few questions, looked at the gate, read the sign, and then turned to Chad. One asked flatly, "Sir, did you climb over the fence to get in?" Chad hesitated. "Yeah, but only because he tried to lock me out." The other officer raised an eyebrow. "So you ignored a posted closure, then trespassed after being told not to?" And that was it. Within minutes, they were cuffing him, not roughly, just matter of fact, like they were used to dealing with entitled people who call 911 and end up regretting it. Janet hadn't shown up yet, but I could only imagine the fury brewing when she'd get the call from her golden boy explaining why he needed to be picked up from the station. I watched as the car backed out of the lot, the last rays of sunlight bouncing off the windshield. The pool was still and quiet again. No shouting. No music. Just the sound of sprinklers kicking on somewhere down the street. I didn't celebrate. But I stood there a few seconds longer than I needed to, soaking in the silence, and thinking how a simple padlock had just shut down an entire dynasty of entitlement. Let me give you some context about who I am, and why any of this even matters. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I work from home as a software consultant. Quiet job, quiet life, just how I like it. I bought my townhome in this suburban community outside of Phoenix 5 years ago. It was a clean, well-maintained neighborhood, complete with neatly trimmed hedges, uniform mailboxes, and a sparkling community pool that always seemed to have just the right amount of sun and shade. It wasn't perfect, but it felt safe, peaceful. The kind of place where you could go for a walk in the evening and nod politely to your neighbors without ever having to actually know them. That suited me just fine. That peace, however, came with a price, literally and figuratively. We pay monthly HOA dues and in return we get shared amenities like the pool, the gym and the clubhouse. On paper it's a simple system. In practice it's a battleground of pettiness and power plays, all revolving around one woman, Janet Holbrook. Or as we call her, HOA Karen. The title isn't meant to be cute or mean-spirited. It's earned. Janet has been on the HOA board for nearly a decade. She's the type who takes minor infractions, like slightly off-color mulch or a garden gnome, and turns them into written violations. She walks the neighborhood with a clipboard, a visor, and a look of condescension so polished it should be trademarked. The worst part? She's not even officially the president of the board anymore. She's just loud and persistent, and nobody wants to challenge her because she has the energy of someone who would absolutely bring your recycling bin placement to small claims court. Over time, she's developed a small circle of allies, mostly retirees and over-involved homeowners who think HOAs should function like miniature governments. She rules through intimidation and policy, and everyone just tries to stay out of her way. And then there's her son, Chad. If Janet is the self-proclaimed sheriff of the neighborhood, Chad is her unqualified deputy. He's in his mid-20s, no steady job, no ambitions that anyone can see. He lives with her, doesn't pay dues, and yet uses the community facilities more than anyone. The gym, the pool, the barbecue patio, you name it, he claims it. Loud music, cigarette butts, trash left behind, it's all part of the package. People have complained, but somehow nothing ever sticks. Janet defends him like he's still a misunderstood teen, not a grown man freeloading off her influence. He's just blowing off steam, she told one neighbor after he blasted music until midnight. You know how young men are. The rest of the community is a mix. You've got young couples with kids, older retirees, some middle-aged professionals like me, and a few renters scattered in. Most people just want to be left alone and don't rock the boat. But there's been a growing sense of resentment over the years. People grumble about Janet's power but do little to confront it. Why? Because conflict in a close-knit neighborhood is a long game. You can't just yell and walk away. You still have to see these people at the mailbox, in the parking lot, at the HOA meetings. The tension is always just beneath the surface like a hairline crack in a window. All it takes is a little pressure and the whole thing shatters. That's why this incident mattered. It wasn't just about a pool or a padlock. It was about the accumulation of unchecked authority and community exhaustion. People were tired of the double standards, tired of seeing Chad do whatever he pleased while the rest of us were slapped with fines for the most trivial things. I once got a notice because my garbage bin was visible from the street for 23 minutes past collection time. But Chad could waltz in with a 12-pack, throw a rager at the pool and no one batted an eye. So when the board approved the emergency pool closure and I volunteered to help implement it, I saw it as more than a chore. I saw it as a small stand. A way to remind certain people that rules applied to everyone, even if their mother was the loudest voice in the room. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just wanted a fair, peaceful community where we all respected the shared spaces we paid for. But in a place where power dynamics had gone unchecked for years, even a small act of enforcement was seen as an act of rebellion. And rebellions, even the quiet ones, have a way of lighting fires under the surface. The first spark didn't come with sirens or screaming. It came in the form of a mundane-looking email. Subject line, pool closure, immediate action required. It was from the HOA's general mailbox, co-signed by 2 board members and citing a mechanical failure in one of the pool's filtration systems. The message was clear. The pool was to be shut down temporarily until repairs could be made, and community volunteers were needed to post signs and enforce the closure for liability reasons. I replied almost instantly, volunteering to help. I had the time, and after months of quietly watching Chad treat the pool like his personal water park, I figured it wouldn't hurt to finally be part of something that restored a little order. The repair was real. The leak had been reported by the maintenance crew and verified by the HOA's contracted technician. Liability insurance premiums had recently increased after another HOA in the area was sued for an injury caused by malfunctioning pool equipment, so everyone on the board, except Janet, notably absent from that meeting, had agreed the temporary closure was necessary. We weren't closing it forever, just for a few days until the repair was complete. It seemed simple, logical, reasonable. Until it wasn't. I arrived at the pool Saturday afternoon with a roll of tape, laminated signs and the pool gate key. There was barely anyone there. A couple of kids had just finished swimming and were toweling off. I gave them a friendly heads up and their parents thanked me. I walked around, checking the pump house, locked, making sure nothing hazardous was visible. Then I went to lock the gate, clicking the heavy padlock into place. That's when I heard it, The unmistakable slap of flip-flops and the familiar sound of bad EDM music leaking from a speaker. He strolled up shirtless, sunglasses on, speaker in one hand and a neon blue sports drink in the other, looking like a frat boy on his 5th summer of unemployment. He saw the locked gate and blinked like it was a personal insult. "What the hell is this?" he asked, rattling the latch. I explained calmly. The pool was closed for repairs. Signs were posted. Notices had been sent. His response? A smirk, followed by laughter. "Yeah right," he scoffed. "You don't get to decide that. You don't even work for the HOA. "I'm not deciding anything," I replied, keeping my voice even. "This was voted on by the board. It's temporary, just a couple of days. The filter system." "I don't care about the filter system," he cut me off. "My mom's on the board. I know what's really going on." And there it was. That smug certainty that the rules didn't apply to him because his mother held the gavel. I reiterated the closure, pointed at the sign, "Pool closed until further notice, by order of HOA board," but it was like trying to reason with a brick wall covered in Axe body spray. He backed up, looked around, then did something I still shake my head at. He climbed over the pool fence. Full on, pulled himself up like a kid sneaking into a drive-in movie and jumped down on the other side with a splash of bravado and zero concern. "See," he shouted, arms raised. "Now what?" My blood pressure surged. Not from fear but from disbelief. I had known he was entitled, but this was another level entirely. I could feel my jaw clench as he made his way to the edge of the pool, dipped a toe in, then turned to smirk at me again. "Call the cops if you want," he said with a mocking laugh. "Tell them someone's swimming in a swimming pool. Let's see how that works out." I didn't need to call the cops. Chad did that himself. As I stood there, stunned and simmering, he pulled out his phone and began dialing. Loudly. Dramatically. "Yes, I'd like to report a man threatening me at the pool," he said to the dispatcher, glancing at me like he was daring me to react. "He's locking me out of the community facilities. I think he might be impersonating an HOA official." It was so absurd I almost laughed. I didn't say a word. I just stepped back and let the moment play out, knowing full well that everything I had done was not only authorized but documented. Still, it didn't stop the knot in my stomach. I felt a wave of anxiety rise. What if the cops believed him? What if Janet twisted the story like she always did? The idea of getting in trouble for simply doing the right thing was maddening. As I waited, my mind replayed every petty notice I'd received over the years. The time they cited me for leaving my trash can out for too long, even though it was collected late. The email about my Halloween decorations being too thematic. The fine for having a wind chime that allegedly disrupted the acoustic harmony of the block. Meanwhile, Chad could drink beer in the hot tub and get away with it because his mother held the HOA's leash. That was the moment something shifted. I wasn't just irritated, I was done. Done playing nice. Done avoiding conflict. Done letting Janet and her man-child son stomp over this neighborhood like they owned it. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But I knew I wasn't backing down this time. It didn't take long for the backlash to begin. Less than 24 hours after Chad's poolside tantrum and his dramatic 911 call, I received a notice taped to my front door in the official HOA envelope, our version of the Scarlet Letter. The letter was typed, printed on HOA letterhead, and signed by none other than Janet Holbrook herself. In a dizzying display of projection, she accused me of unauthorized action, intimidating behavior toward fellow residents, and tampering with community infrastructure. I read it twice, stunned. She was actually trying to flip the entire situation on its head and make it look like I had violated HOA rules, by enforcing the rules. At first, I tried to reason with her. I sent a calm, well-documented email to the rest of the board, including time-stamped photos of the padlocked gate, a scan of the email authorizing the closure, and a copy of the board meeting minutes that clearly showed the vote in favor of temporarily shutting the pool. I copied Janet, hoping she'd see reason, or at least back off once she realized the paper trail made her position indefensible. She never replied to me directly, but the next day, I received a new notice stating that my volunteer privileges were suspended pending review. Apparently, I was now under an internal investigation by the HOA's Compliance Committee, a committee which of course she chaired. Neighbors started asking questions. Why is the pool still locked? Did someone really call the cops? Are we being fined for something? The board hadn't issued any new updates, and I could tell the silence was fueling speculation. I explained the situation quietly to a few people I trusted, my next-door neighbor, an older couple across the street, but even those conversations felt risky. In an HOA where the loudest voice got the final word, Information was currency, and I didn't know who would report back to Janet. That kind of paranoia wasn't my default setting, but I could feel it creeping in. Every time I checked my mailbox, I half expected to find another citation. Every time I opened my email, I braced myself for a reprimand. Then came the fines. A $75 charge appeared on my monthly HOA portal, citing unauthorized locking of community amenities. I stared at the screen, jaw clenched, pulse rising. It was petty, yes, but also strategic. A calculated jab designed to wear me down, to make me question whether it was worth it to keep pushing. But I knew what this really was. A message. Not just to me but to everyone else who might dare challenge the pecking order. Janet wasn't protecting community rules, she was protecting her ego. I considered letting it go. Just paying the fine, walking away, returning to my quiet corner of suburbia. But every time I thought about backing down, I pictured Chad smirking from behind his sunglasses, beer in hand, feet in the water he wasn't supposed to be in. I thought about the way Janet twisted logic into threats, spinning narratives to maintain her control. And I thought about the dozens of other residents who, like me, had just tried to live peacefully, but got steamrolled by arbitrary rules and selective enforcement. So I started digging. I went through archived newsletters, HOA policy documents, Arizona HOA statutes, anything I could find. I learned that Janet's compliance committee had never been formally ratified by a full board vote, meaning its authority was murky at best. I found inconsistencies in fine schedules and enforcement notices. I discovered that the HOA bylaws required an open hearing before disciplinary action could be taken, and no such hearing had been scheduled or offered to me. I printed everything, highlighted the key clauses, and organized it into a binder. Yes, a literal binder. I was becoming that guy, and I didn't even care anymore. The tipping point came when another board member, a quiet woman named Maria who had mostly stayed in Janet's shadow, reached out to me privately. "I heard what happened with the pool," she said, almost whispering over the phone. "You did the right thing. I voted for the closure too. Janet's trying to make it go away like it never happened." That small gesture of support, that acknowledgement that I wasn't alone, changed everything. If Maria felt that way, maybe others did too. Maybe the silence from the neighborhood wasn't apathy, it was fear. And if one person stood up, maybe others would follow. But it had to be careful. Strategic. Because this wasn't just a dispute anymore, it was a power struggle. And if I was going to win, I had to play by the rules better than they did. I stopped reacting emotionally and started planning methodically. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was becoming a one-man resistance, with spreadsheets. The real turning point didn't come with a bang. It came one night while I was reading through our community bylaws for the third time, highlighter in hand, binder open, coffee gone cold. Somewhere between a clause about annual meeting protocols and a paragraph on landscaping violations, I found it, the line that changed everything. All disciplinary actions must be approved by a majority vote of the board and documented in publicly accessible minutes. My eyes widened. That fine I got? The suspension of my volunteer status? None of that had ever been brought up in a public meeting. There were no minutes, no majority vote, no transparency, which meant none of it was legitimate. That was my aha moment. It hit me all at once. Janet wasn't just bending the rules, she was breaking them. And everyone let her, either because they didn't know any better or they didn't want the headache of challenging her. But now I did know better. And I wasn't afraid of headaches anymore. I realized the only thing holding her power together was illusion, the illusion of control, of authority, of procedure. Once that illusion cracked, everything else would follow. So I built a plan. Step 1, documentation. I compiled every communication, every notice, every screenshot and printed email. I requested official HOA meeting records through our state's HOA disclosure requirement statute, a right homeowners often don't realize they have. I attended the next board meeting in person, sitting in the front row, binder in hand, notepad ready. I didn't raise my voice or wave my arms. I just asked pointed, calm, lawful questions during the open forum. Was a vote held before issuing disciplinary action against me? Can you cite where that was recorded in the minutes? Has this fine gone through proper due process as outlined in Article 7, Section 3 of our bylaws? Janet was caught completely off guard. She stammered, glanced at the other board members, tried to deflect. But the room was different this time. People were paying attention. For the first time, someone was holding her accountable with the actual rules she claimed to defend. She couldn't yell her way through it. She couldn't bully me into silence. Because I had something stronger than bluster. I had facts. Step 2, community awareness. I created a simple fact-based summary of what had happened. No drama, no rants, just bullet points and quotes from the bylaws. I slid it into people's mail slots. Not everyone responded, but a surprising number did. A single mother from 2 buildings down emailed me to say she'd received similar threats when her son accidentally left a toy in the common area. A retired veteran shared that he'd been fined twice for minor violations, both times with no hearing. Stories poured in. And more importantly, people started talking. Step 3, pressure. With support quietly building, I organized a petition to call for a special HOA meeting, something allowed under our charter if 15% of homeowners signed on. I didn't campaign loudly. I walked the neighborhood in the evenings, binder in one hand, talking to people like a neighbor, not a revolutionary. I listened more than I spoke. I reminded them that this wasn't about sides or drama. It was about fairness, accountability, and respect for the rules we all paid to uphold. The signatures added up. Some people signed with relief. Others signed with cautious hope. But by the end of the week I had more than enough. I submitted the petition formally, CC'd every board member, and included a proposal to review current disciplinary procedures and the proper limits of board authority. I was polite, respectful, but firm. And for the first time, Janet had no playbook. She couldn't call it a witch hunt. Everything was by the book. She couldn't ignore it. The petition met quorum. She couldn't intimidate me. I had already been through the worst and come out stronger. The entire structure she'd leaned on for years, fear, confusion, silence, was collapsing under the weight of one undeniable truth. She was wrong. And I wasn't alone anymore. The night before the meeting, I stood outside the pool, the same one Chad had trespassed into, and looked at the freshly repaired pump, the now legal padlock on the gate, and the glow of porch lights across the complex. I felt a strange mix of adrenaline and calm. I wasn't sure how the meeting would go. But I knew this much. The days of unchecked authority in our little HOA kingdom were numbered. And all it had taken was a binder, a broken rule, and the decision not to back down. The special meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at 6:30 p.m. in the community clubhouse. I arrived 15 minutes early, binder tucked under my arm like armor, and found the place already half full. More residents than I'd seen at any HOA meeting in years. Couples, retirees, parents with toddlers on their hips, even that grumpy guy from the end unit who never left his porch. Something had shifted. People weren't just curious anymore. They were invested. And when I glanced toward the head table where the board members sat, I saw it clearly on Janet's face, panic disguised as poise. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, but the tension was so thick you could chew it. Janet tried to speed through the agenda, rattling off procedural notes in her usual condescending tone, but when she reached item 5, review of disciplinary policy following recent events, I raised my hand. Not tentatively. Not politely. With purpose. She called on me with a forced smile that didn't touch her eyes. I stood, opened my binder, and began reading aloud. In a calm, steady voice, I outlined every violation of protocol that had occurred in my case. The lack of due process, the absence of a board vote, the misuse of authority to issue fines and suspensions without oversight. I quoted bylaws, referenced state regulations, and even cited similar HOA cases from nearby communities. Then I turned to the audience, our neighbors, the people who had quietly endured Janet's reign for years, and asked a simple question: how many of you have ever been fined or warned for something you didn't fully understand or get a chance to discuss? Hands went up. More than half the room. Janet tried to interrupt, accusing me of grandstanding, but another board member, Maria, stepped in and said, "Let him finish." The crowd nodded in support. For once, Janet wasn't in control of the narrative. I continued, describing how Chad had trespassed into a closed pool, made a false 911 call, and then faced no consequences, while I was punished for locking a gate at the board's request. I didn't need to embellish, the facts spoke volumes. Then, almost on cue, came the final twist. Someone in the audience, a neighbor named Kevin, stood up and said, "Didn't I see your son jump the pool fence on video? My security cam caught it. Should I pull it up?" The room fell silent. Janet turned red. Someone stifled a laugh. It was the first time I saw her truly flustered. "This isn't about my son," she said sharply, but the damage was done. The illusion of her moral high ground had shattered. The vote that followed wasn't just about me anymore, it was about reclaiming fairness. The board agreed unanimously, Janet abstained of course, to suspend all pending fines and disciplinary actions issued without a proper vote. A subcommittee was formed to revise the community's enforcement procedures, and Maria was appointed chair. Janet sat stone-faced, her lips pursed, trying to hold together the crumbling image of control. The meeting ended with scattered applause and, for the first time, genuine conversation among neighbors who had mostly kept their heads down for too long. But the real payoff came a week later. I was walking my dog around the community when I noticed 2 police cruisers parked by the pool entrance. Curious, I wandered over and saw Chad, shirtless again, being handcuffed, red-faced and yelling. Turns out, after the meeting, the board had relocked the pool pending inspection, and Chad, convinced he was immune to consequences, had once again scaled the gate. Only this time, someone else called the police, a mother whose toddler had nearly wandered in behind him. She was furious. She wanted charges pressed. When the officer asked if Chad had permission to be there, Janet came rushing out of her unit and tried to talk her way through it. "He's my son, he lives here, this is all just a misunderstanding." But the officer wasn't having it. "He doesn't have authority to enter a locked facility. That's trespassing." Just like that, Chad was placed in the back of the cruiser, fuming. I didn't gloat. I didn't cheer. I just stood there quietly, arms crossed, watching justice, not revenge, unfold. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing I hadn't needed to scream or manipulate or stoop to anyone's level. All I'd done was hold up a mirror, and what stared back at them was their own failure. Later that evening, I found a typed note in my mailbox. No envelope. Just a single sheet of paper that read, "Apologies for how things were handled. Going forward, we'll do better." No signature, but I recognized the careful formatting and Times New Roman font, Janet's signature style. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In the weeks that followed, our neighborhood felt different. Not overnight, not dramatically, but subtly, steadily. The kind of shift you only notice after months of holding your breath and finally exhaling. For the first time in years, people walked past each other with something more than wary nods. Conversations started happening across driveways and over backyard fences. Kids chalked drawings on sidewalks without their parents nervously glancing over their shoulders, afraid of an anonymous complaint. And that once feared HOA board? It began to feel less like an enforcement squad and more like neighbors again. The disciplinary subcommittee met twice a month in the clubhouse, and I attended every meeting, not out of vengeance or obsession but because I wanted to help shape what came next. Maria turned out to be an excellent chair, fair and sharp-eyed, with a calm authority that stood in stark contrast to Janet's heavy-handedness. Together we rewrote the violation procedures, clear notice requirements, the right to a hearing, escalation limits, and, most importantly, mandatory board approval before fines could be issued. We even added a community mediation step to allow for neighbor-to-neighbor conflict resolution before HOA involvement. Common sense changes. But they felt revolutionary in a place where power had once been absolute. Janet, for her part, didn't resign, but she retreated. She still showed up at meetings, still offered opinions, but the air of command was gone. The community no longer deferred to her. She was just another vote, no longer the voice. Chad kept a low profile too. After his brief encounter with the police, he seemed to vanish for a while. No more late-night parties, no more gate hopping. I heard he took a job out of town, and though I can't say I missed him, I also didn't hold on to the grudge. At the end of the day, he was a symptom, not the source. One Saturday morning, a small celebration was held at the pool. The pumps were finally fixed, and the area reopened under new usage rules. Updated hours, a better key fob system, and a posted contact list for concerns. It was nothing fancy. A few tables of snacks, folding chairs, a Bluetooth speaker playing 80s hits. But people showed up. Dozens. And they stayed. They laughed. They talked. I stood back near the diving board and watched as kids splashed and neighbors mingled. That pool, once a battleground, had become what it was meant to be again. A gathering place, not a wedge. Maria came over at one point and handed me a soda. "You know," she said, "if you ever want to run for a board seat, I think you'd have more support than you realize." I laughed genuinely. I hadn't thought that far ahead. All I'd wanted was fairness, to be heard, to make things right. But hearing her say it, I realized something important. You don't have to chase power to earn respect. Sometimes just standing up, once firmly with the truth behind you, is enough to shift the tide. Reflecting on everything now, I see how close I came to letting it all go. It would have been easier to pay the fine, unlock the gate, and go back to living quietly. To tell myself that none of it mattered. But I'm glad I didn't. Because it did matter, not just for me but for the next person who gets a notice for a silly violation, or who dares question something that doesn't feel right. Rules are important. But only when they're fair. And only when they're applied equally. The irony? All of this started because I tried to do the right thing, Lock a pool for safety, follow a procedure, prevent damage. And for that, I was labeled difficult. A troublemaker. But in the end, that label turned into something else. Advocate. Ally. Neighbor. The very things that make a community stronger.